Do you want to hear a scary true bedtime story? Something to keep you up tonight. Have you ever lived at a place that had a small shed out back? Something like a tool shed that was barely used? Well, if you wanted even more of a reason to stay away from something like that, get a load of what one girl named Gray Charleston saw when she started hearing things coming from her shed. Enjoy this allegedly true story. Real-life alien encounters are coming up tomorrow. I used to live in what was basically a cabin in the middle of the woods. My family had always been poor, and when my mom basically disappeared one day, my dad and I ended up moving to the cheapest place my dad could afford. That was the old cabin. It was a backwoods single-bedroom home out in the boonies of Louisiana. We lived in Missouri before this, so moving to Louisiana was quite a big change for me. It was almost always so boggy or humid outside, and the bugs were relentless. I was miserable most of the time, but far be it for me to complain, as my father did absolutely everything he could for us. He worked full-time at some sort of metal production factory. I can't quite remember what it was exactly, but that's what my childhood memory is telling me. I do remember that when he'd get home, he'd head right back out, driving a limo for folks in the nearby town during his free time. It was a weird gig, but I had an aunt that lived in town, and somehow she had a spare limo. She said she had inherited it and never used it, so she was allowing my dad to drive it as long as he gave her 10% of the earnings, which sounds extremely fair to me. I always thought it was cool seeing my father drive that limo. Prom season was quite lucrative as well, and I remember my dad always took me out for ice cream and a movie during that time each year. It was a humble life, but it was a life that allowed me to get close to my father, a time that also allowed me to explore the nature around us. It was the nature part that scared me. I was terribly afraid of the dark. As I slept in a separate bed in my dad's room, it probably didn't help. Sleeping alone was something that I wasn't used to, especially being alone at night. I didn't like it one bit. What really creeped me out was the shed in the backyard. It resembled one of those typical outhouses from the Tom and Jerry cartoons. It stood just a few yards from the edge of the tree line, ominously, wood missing in places, and wasps usually overrunning it during the summer. Little did I know when we moved in that there was far more to that shed, but I would soon learn as the first winter at the cabin approached. Now, winter in Louisiana can be really cold at times, or even warm some years, but seemingly never in between from what I experienced. That year was a cold one, though. Around that time, Dad had begun construction on the side of the cabin, putting down rebar, then concrete, and in no time, my dad was putting the finishing touches on what was to be my room. Honestly, though, I wasn't excited. I should have been, but the thought of being left alone, especially on the opposite side of the cabin from my father, it didn't sit well with me. Yet, whenever my dad asked about me looking forward to my room, or how I was going to decorate it, I would always be sure to reply with a smile and a "thank you, Daddy." When my room was finished, I toughed it out and readily settled into my new room, moving my bed and blankets and pillows from Dad's room. The walls were bare and it was cold, but the room was much newer and nicer than the rest of the cabin. I was grateful. It was on that first night when I slept in my room. I was finally about to fall asleep when I heard something that woke me up into a cold sweat. The sound reminded me of our old dog that had passed away, the way he'd claw on the back door to get us to open it. Except this sound was much heavier. There was far more weight behind it. I listened closely, my mouth opening further by the moment. Soon I realized it was coming from outside. My father had placed a window in my room on the north side, and I had made sure to sleep at an angle on a wall where I couldn't see outside that window. But as the sound continued, I found myself climbing out of bed and approaching the window to see outside. At the window, the moon was incredibly bright and shone our backyard almost like it was daytime, almost. I looked to my left toward the tree line where the shed was, and of course, that's where the noise was coming from. But as I stare into the distance at the shed, I can see something causing the door to move. Then suddenly, the door gave way and whatever it was stepped inside, after which the door fell back to its original position. It happened suddenly, so I hadn't seen what crawled into the shed. But I do know that when the door fell shut again with the thing inside, the clawing sound stopped. There was an animal inside our shed. I ran out of my room, not entirely scared per se, but definitely curious and a bit worried. I ran to my father's room straight away, only to find a note taped to his door. It said, "Gray, I'll be back before morning, maybe before you even see this. Auntie had a heart attack. Promise I'll be back before breakfast." Come on, Dad, I thought. Why couldn't he have just woke me up, or maybe even brought me with him, or at least told me? He overthought things sometimes. So I was alone at the cabin, and there was something in the shed maybe 20 yards from my bedroom window. It's just a dog, I told myself. Well, if it was just a dog, it'd be fine if I went outside and checked on it. For the first time in my life, my curiosity was overpowering my fear. Maybe I was finally growing up, because part of me that night genuinely felt a bit of excitement at the idea of exploring this mystery on my own. After all, if I knew what it was or wasn't, I would be able to sleep better. So that's what I did. I made that horror movie mistake that makes you want to scream at the screen from your seat on the couch. I grabbed my father's flashlight and I walked outside. I know you're probably rolling your eyes. I regret doing this, believe me. But there was some sort of confidence in me that night. A confidence that hasn't returned since, and you'll soon see why. Outside it was pretty nippy, but I had my jacket and slippers on, so I made my way steadily to the shed. After rounding the corner of the cabin, I could see it there in the moonlight. It didn't look so bad, the shed. It was the woods around me that were far more intimidating. My confidence continued to drive me, though. It drove me until I made it to the entrance of the shed. There, I could see at least 3 abandoned wasp nests just from that spot. Luckily, most creepy crawlies were dormant at the time, except for whatever was in the shed. I wasn't about to yank the door open. Definitely not. Instead, I'd slowly open it and peek in with my flashlight. Who knows what the animal inside would do if I startled it? Slow and steady, I reminded myself. I grabbed the handle of the door, which felt like it could come off if I gave it a good yank. I slowly pushed the shed door inward and shone the flashlight on every inch of the inside. My heart was pounding so hard, it sounded like a distant drum beat in my ear. As my pulse raced, the door widened, and soon I saw it. There was nothing in the shed. My hands fell to my side. Had I been dreaming the whole thing? Had it left before I got outside? Maybe it was just the wind after all. I exhaled and almost laughed. I got all worked up and brave for nothing. Just before I closed the shed door, before I walked mindlessly back inside to a peaceful night's sleep, my light caught something that reflected the light. Eyes. Eyes coming from the ground. I was frozen. I stood still, microscopically moving my hand until the light showed me where the eyes were coming from. There was a face in the ground. When I saw it, I began to cry. It was definitely a face. The face of something that looked like it had buried itself in the dirt face up. Its eyes were wide open now, and their attention was entirely focused on me. What was I even looking at? I remember thinking. Its face looked like it had been stretched like pizza dough, only for it to dry that way. In the lighting, its skin was a mix of deep purple and brown, an unnatural shade for the skin of any healthy animal. And its teeth were horrible, and it was showing them to me in a silent snarl. It didn't seem to be happy that I was in its shed, and it seemed to be telling me to get out. That was it for me. I took its warning, running for my life back into our cabin. Once inside, I locked the door, and I crawled into my dad's bed for the remainder of that night. I didn't even try to go back to sleep. Rather, I listened for anything that sounded like movement. But the only sound that came around 5 hours later. It was the scratching again, followed by the sound of the shed door closing back in place, then very faint footsteps disappearing into the trees. And that was it. I know you want to hear more. You want to hear that I heard it and saw it again, but I didn't. I never had to worry about it again after that. Something tells me that once it saw me, once it discovered that someone found its sleeping spot, it didn't want to come back. Was it scared of me? I mean, something with a face like that. I wouldn't think it'd be scared of anything. Be careful if you live in the woods in northern Louisiana. Something is looking for a place to sleep.